Spiritual awakening is often sold as liberation, like a clean break from temptation, a new mind, a new soul, a new you. But there's a detail almost no one warns you about. For many people, awakening doesn't erase desire. It amplifies it. And that's where the secret battle begins. Because outwardly, the spiritually awake can look untouchable, calm, grounded, devoted to meaning, the kind of person who seems above the chaos. Yet in private, something very human keeps resurfacing. A pull, a craving, a sudden wave of lust that feels completely out of place, almost like it doesn't match the person they've become. So they hide it. They tell themselves it's just a phase. They pray harder. They try to control their mind. They try to rise above the body. And the more they fight it, the more it returns. Not always loudly. Sometimes it returns as subtle obsession, a compulsive fantasy, a pattern of scrolling, searching, escaping, a private ritual that feels comforting for a moment and crushing afterward. Here's the part that confuses them most. They didn't expect this after awakening. They expected purity, peace, clarity. Instead, they found a shadow. And Carl Jung would say something that might change the way you see this struggle forever. He would say the problem isn't that you have desire. The problem is what you've done with it. Because the psyche has a law. What you reject doesn't disappear. It goes underground. And underground, it doesn't get weaker. It gets smarter. It becomes symbolic. It becomes compulsive. So in this video, we are not going to treat lust like a moral failure. We are going to treat it like a message. A message from the parts of you that awakening didn't erase. Because they were never meant to be erased. And once you see what Jung saw, you'll realize something unsettling, but freeing. This battle isn't proof that you're not spiritual enough. It might be proof that you're standing right at the edge of integration. And the next question is the one most people avoid. Why does awakening make this stronger, not weaker? The easiest way to understand what's happening is to imagine a dam, a massive structure built to control water, to regulate its force, to prevent chaos. At first, everything looks stable. The water is contained. The surface seems calm. From a distance, you might even think the problem is gone. But the most important part of a dam is what you don't see, because beneath that calm surface, pressure is building. In Jungian terms, that water is libido, and Jung's definition is wider than most people realize. He didn't reduce libido to sex alone. He described it as psychic energy, the living force behind longing, creativity, attachment, ambition, hunger for meaning, and the drive toward wholeness. Spiritual awakening often intensifies this energy, not because awakening makes you more sinful, but because awakening makes you more alive. Your awareness expands. Your sensitivity sharpens. You begin to feel what you used to numb. You start noticing subtle impulses you once ignored. You become more conscious of the body, of emotion, of desire. And this is where many spiritually awake people make a crucial mistake. Instead of learning how to relate to this rising energy, they try to outgrow it. They raise the dam higher. They meditate more, but with a hidden motive, control. They discipline the body, but with a quiet fear of instinct. They adopt spiritual ideals that sound noble, yet unconsciously function like a concrete wall. No cravings. No urges, no weakness. This is what Jung would call a one-sidedness of consciousness. When the ego identifies too strongly with an ideal, purity, light, transcendence, being above it, the psyche compensates. Because the psyche is not interested in perfection. It is interested in balance. Jung believed the unconscious has a compensatory function. If consciousness becomes too elevated, too rigid, too moralized, the unconscious responds by strengthening what has been excluded. In other words, the higher the dam, the stronger the water behind it. And this is why repression can feel like progress at first. You might go weeks, even months, feeling steady, disciplined, in control, but the pressure doesn't vanish. It concentrates. The dam doesn't eliminate water. It only delays movement. And energy always seeks movement. If it cannot flow forward into conscious life, into creativity, connection, embodiment, honest intimacy, it doesn't simply evaporate. It turns inward. It becomes symbolic. It becomes compulsive. This is where the shadow enters. Jung's shadow is not just bad behavior. It's everything you refuse to see in yourself. Everything you disown because it threatens your self-image. Everything you label as unspiritual, unclean, unacceptable. So the spiritually awake person may not be fighting lust itself. They may be fighting the idea that lust means they failed. And that idea becomes the war. Then the leaks begin. Not always dramatically. Sometimes it's subtle. A fantasy that appears without invitation. A sudden obsession with a stranger. A compulsive loop of images that feels strangely soothing. A private ritual that calms anxiety for a moment, and then leaves shame behind like a shadow on the floor. This is how the unconscious finds cracks. And if the pressure grows large enough, the release won't be gentle. It will feel sudden, overwhelming, out of proportion, not because the desire is too strong, but because it has been stored, compressed, and denied a channel. Jung warned that blocked libido doesn't disappear, it regresses. Meaning, it flows backward into more primitive expressions, not because you are weak, but because the psyche will choose a lower outlet, if a higher one is sealed shut. This is also why the spiritually awake often feel confused by themselves. They think, I should be beyond this. But Jung would say that thought itself is the problem, because beyond is not the same as integrated. A healthy psyche doesn't rely on higher walls. It relies on channels. Integration is not about holding back the water forever. It's about learning how to guide its flow. So the energy doesn't have to break you, just to be acknowledged. And once you see it this way, another uncomfortable truth emerges. The problem isn't the intensity of your desire. The problem is that no one taught you what this energy is actually trying to become. If we keep treating lust as a moral problem, we'll keep fighting it at the wrong level. In Jungian psychology, the psyche rarely speaks in literal terms. It speaks in symbols. That means many of the strongest urges you experience are not simply asking to be obeyed or crushed. They are asking to be understood, because psychic energy that cannot move forward consciously will often reorganize itself around an image, a fantasy, a person, or a scenario that can carry the weight of what you've refused to integrate. This is why what you call lust may not be about sex in the simplistic way people assume. Sometimes it's about vitality, about a life that has become too controlled, too sterile, too cerebral. When you live for long periods in strict self-monitoring, in discipline without softness, in spirituality used as a form of emotional anesthesia, your psyche begins to crave aliveness. It wants heat back in the bloodstream. It wants sensation, immediacy, and presence. And sexuality, because it's ancient, powerful, and embodied, becomes one of the fastest doorways back into intensity. Other times, lust is a distorted language for connection, not merely contact with another body, but contact with life itself, intimacy, tenderness, emotional risk, the feeling of being seen and responded to. Many spiritually awake people become exceptionally skilled at solitude and detachment. They learn to observe thoughts like passing clouds, to rise above reactivity, to build a private inner sanctuary. But the soul is not meant to live only in the sky. In Jung's terms, this is where eros matters, not as weakness, not as indulgence, but as the principle of relatedness, the force that binds us to people, to meaning, to embodiment. When eros is neglected, it doesn't die. It becomes hunger. And sometimes, this is the part that surprises people the most. Lust is actually a symbol of wholeness. The craving is not fundamentally for pleasure, but for completion. The psyche senses something missing, a warmth you abandoned to survive, a tenderness you buried to stay functional, a playful instinctive self you exiled to become good, spiritual, in control. The unconscious tries to bring these qualities back, and it wraps them in the most magnetic packaging it knows: desire. Because desire has the power to force your attention toward what you've been avoiding. This is also why the object of lust can feel almost sacred, almost fated, almost like destiny. Not because it is destiny, but because the psyche uses intensity the way it uses dreams, as a spotlight. Jung believed libido is not random, it is directional. It moves toward individuation, toward the recovery of the whole self. So the real question is rarely, how do I kill this desire? The more honest question is, what is this desire pointing to in me? This is where shame becomes so dangerous. Shame doesn't dissolve desire. It drives it deeper into the unconscious, where it becomes more autonomous. Jung warned that when a complex becomes autonomous, it starts behaving like a separate personality inside you. You don't feel like you have desire. You feel like desire has you. And then lust stops feeling human and starts feeling haunting, as if something is pulling strings in the dark. But if lust is symbolic, then the next step isn't suppression, it's interpretation. And once you begin to interpret it, you run straight into one of Jung's most unsettling insights, because very often, the person you crave is not the person you're actually craving. You're craving what you projected onto them. And that's where the anima enters. Jung believed that one of the most common reasons desire becomes obsessive is projection, when an unconscious part of the psyche is experienced as if it belongs to someone else. This is especially true with the anima and animus, the inner feminine and masculine figures that shape how we experience love, longing, beauty, intimacy, and emotional depth. When these inner forces are not consciously related to, they don't vanish. They go outward. They attach themselves to a face, a voice, a body, a presence, and suddenly the attraction feels bigger than reality. This is why the spiritually awake can feel confused by their own intensity. On the surface, it looks like lust. It feels like lust. But underneath, the psyche may be trying to reunite you with a missing quality of your own soul. The other person becomes a screen, and onto that screen your unconscious projects everything you have not yet embodied: tenderness, sensuality, confidence, softness, wildness, warmth, play, even the capacity to receive love without suspicion. The longing is real, but it is not always directed at the person as they truly are. It is directed at what they symbolize inside you. Jung would say that this is why obsession feels so irrational. You can tell yourself, logically, that the person is not that special. You can see the flaws. You can even feel embarrassed by how much you think about them. And yet the pull remains, because you are not dealing with logic. You are dealing with archetypal energy. When an archetype is activated, it doesn't behave like a preference. It behaves like a destiny. It creates the sense that something essential is at stake. For the spiritually awake, this mechanism can become even more powerful, because awakening increases sensitivity to inner imagery. You become more attuned to symbolism, to synchronicities, to subtle emotional currents. And if you're not careful, the psyche can use that sensitivity to dress up projection in spiritual language. You don't just feel desire, you feel signs. You don't just feel attraction, you feel alignment. You don't just feel obsession, you feel a connection you can't explain. The mind becomes creative, building a myth around a person, because myths are the natural language of the unconscious. This is why Jung's work can feel both unsettling and liberating. Unsettling, because it suggests that part of what you're chasing is not outside you. Liberating, because it means you are not powerless. If the obsession is fueled by projection, then the path forward is not endless restraint, it's retrieval. It's taking back what you've given away unconsciously and recognizing it as yours. In practical terms, this begins with a different kind of question. Not, how do I stop wanting them? But, what part of me awakens when I imagine them? What qualities do they seem to carry? What feelings do they stir that you struggle to access in your daily life? What do you believe their presence would finally give you? Peace, intensity, acceptance, permission, escape? Because very often, the psyche is using a person as a symbol to reveal what your conscious life has been starving. And here's the paradox. The more you deny this inner figure, the more intense the projection becomes. The less you relate to your anima consciously, the more she will appear outside you like a spell. And when you try to fight the spell with sheer willpower, you only strengthen it, because willpower is a function of the ego, and the ego is usually weaker than an activated archetype. That's why the spiritually awake can find themselves battling lust in silence. They are not just resisting a desire, they are resisting a psychic compensation. They are resisting the return of something they disowned in the name of being above it. And until they understand what is being asked of them, the psyche will keep generating new screens, new faces, new fantasies, new obsessions, because the message has not been received. This is the point where Jung would introduce a metaphor that cuts straight through the confusion, because it reveals the hidden structure behind the struggle, the monastery and the brothel. And once you understand that tension, you'll see why spirituality, when it becomes one-sided, doesn't heal desire. It escalates it. Jung observed something that made many religious and spiritual people uncomfortable. He noticed that whenever the psyche identifies too strongly with one extreme, the unconscious responds by strengthening the opposite. Not as a punishment, and not as rebellion, but as compensation. The psyche is self-regulating. It is always trying to restore balance, even when the ego believes it knows what higher or better should look like. This is where Jung's metaphor of the monastery and the brothel becomes so revealing. The monastery represents order, discipline, restraint, devotion to higher ideals, and the aspiration to rise above instinct. The brothel represents instinct, embodiment, desire, chaos, and the raw forces of life. Most people assume that spiritual growth means moving away from one and toward the other. Jung saw it differently. He saw that when the monastery is exalted too rigidly in consciousness, the brothel grows in the unconscious. For the spiritually awake, this often happens quietly. They build a strong identity around being disciplined, aware, morally clean, and inwardly controlled. They don't merely practice spirituality, they become identified with it. Their ego fuses with an image of light, clarity, and transcendence. But what doesn't fit that image doesn't disappear. It is pushed down, labeled unworthy, and denied a voice. This is what Jung called spiritual inflation. When the ego over-identifies with a higher position, it loses contact with the totality of the psyche. And when that happens, the unconscious compensates by amplifying what has been excluded. Desire becomes louder. Fantasies become more vivid. The pull toward what feels forbidden intensifies. Not because the person is regressing, but because the psyche is trying to restore wholeness. This is why moral struggle alone never resolves lust. The more someone tries to defeat instinct through ideals, the more polarized the inner world becomes. Consciousness rises higher, but the unconscious sinks deeper, and the gap between the two fills with tension. Jung warned that this kind of split makes a person vulnerable to sudden reversals, moments where the repressed side erupts with surprising force, leaving confusion and shame in its wake. What makes this especially painful for the spiritually awake is the sense of contradiction. They ask themselves how they can feel so drawn towards something that seems to oppose everything they value. But Jung would say that the conflict is not between good and evil. It is between one-sided consciousness and the neglected totality of the self. The psyche does not want you to abandon the monastery. It wants you to stop pretending the brothel doesn't exist. Wholeness does not come from choosing one side and erasing the other. It comes from holding the tension between them without collapsing into either extreme. This is where many spiritual paths fail people. They teach transcendence without integration. They encourage rising above instinct without learning how to carry instinct consciously. And when instinct inevitably returns, the individual feels like a fraud, rather than recognizing the return as a call to deeper psychological work. Jung believed that true spiritual maturity includes the capacity to remain in tension, to feel desire without acting it out blindly, to acknowledge instinct without identifying with it, to allow opposing forces to exist in consciousness without immediately trying to resolve them through repression or indulgence. This tension is uncomfortable. It strips away simple answers. It forces humility. But it is also the doorway to individuation. Because once you stop trying to eliminate one side of yourself, a different question emerges, one that changes the entire struggle. If repression is not the solution, and indulgence is not the solution either, then what is? That question leads us to the distinction Jung cared about most. Integration versus abstinence. Jung was clear about this point, even if many people prefer to ignore it. Individuation is not about becoming instinct-free. It's about becoming conscious of instinct. Abstinence can look like maturity from the outside, but without awareness, it often functions as avoidance. Integration, on the other hand, means learning to hold desire in consciousness without either acting it out blindly or banishing it into the unconscious. You can see this distinction echoed in modern language through a simple cultural lens. Think of films like Black Swan, where perfection, discipline, and purity are pursued so intensely that the shadow takes over in destructive ways. The collapse doesn't happen because desire exists, but because it was denied until it demanded control. Jung would say the same dynamic plays out quietly in everyday lives, not as drama, but as tension, obsession, and inner fragmentation. Integration doesn't mean indulgence. It means presence. It means being able to feel desire without becoming possessed by it, to recognize its symbolic message without literalizing it, to let energy move into creativity, embodiment, honest intimacy, or self-understanding instead of forcing it to find release through secrecy and shame. This is why repression feels exhausting, while integration feels grounding. One demands constant effort. The other creates coherence. If you're spiritually awake and you still battle lust in silence, it doesn't mean you're failing. It means something in you is demanding honesty. Freud would have framed this struggle primarily in terms of sexual drive and repression, how forbidden impulses return through symptoms when they are pushed down. Jung didn't dismiss that, but he widened the lens. For Jung, libido wasn't only sexual. It was psychic energy itself, the force behind longing, creativity, intimacy, and the drive toward wholeness. So the question isn't merely how do I control this impulse, but what is this energy trying to become in me? Jung believed the psyche is always moving toward balance, and whatever you exile into the unconscious doesn't vanish. It returns, not to destroy you, but to be recognized. The shadow doesn't want your collapse. It wants your attention. And when desire is understood as symbolic and directional, it begins to change shape. What once felt like a haunting starts to feel like information. What once felt like temptation starts to feel like a doorway. Because the real question was never, How do I become a person who doesn't feel this? The real question is, what part of me is trying to come back to life? So if this video put words to something you've been fighting privately, take a second and let me know in the comments. Have you felt this contradiction after awakening, this strange intensity that seems to grow in silence? And if you want more Jungian insights like this, where we don't moralize the psyche, we decode it, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Hidden Mind. Because in the next video, we are going deeper into spiritual awakening, but from a different angle. If lust can be a shadow signal, what other symptoms are actually the psyche trying to balance? What if the next struggle you're calling a setback is really the unconscious trying to complete you? Hold that question, and I'll see you there.